Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, as a scandal-ridden Catholic Church, international organizations, major corporations, and left-wing philanthropists all push for abolishing capital punishment, we look at the public's responses and the arguments behind them. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. When Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia passed away in January 2016, organized left-wing interests, led by the Bermuda-based Atlantic Philanthropies, the Pass-Through Tides Foundation, and the Open Society Foundations, founded by megadonor George Soros, all thought they had a path toward one of their top criminal justice goals, ending the death penalty, ideally by a Supreme Court decision that would find it unconstitutional. That cause was set back by the 2016 elections, and how. Not only did the election of President Donald Trump, who's called for expanding the death penalty for drug crimes, give conservatives the opportunity to replace first Scalia and now retired Justice Anthony Kennedy with constitutionalists likely to uphold capital punishment, but in addition, voters in Nebraska, Oklahoma, and even California passed ballot measures that uphold the use of the death penalty. With the Supreme Court not likely to be open to finding the punishment unconstitutional in the foreseeable future, the debate over if, when, and how the government should take the lives of certain criminals moves into corporate boardrooms and legislative spheres. Well, Mike, we've got a widespread podcast today, and by the way, folks, we have at the end of the show, we'll have an important announcement for you. But let's start with the background. What is the current legal status of capital punishment in America?
So 31 states and the federal government involves injecting the prisoner with a lethal cocktail of sedatives. There are the left always likes to point out that the U.S. is an outlier among major Western industrialized democracies. The European Union, all the European Union countries have abolished the death penalty. Most of all the other countries of Europe, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland have all abolished the death penalty. Most of Latin America has abolished the death penalty. The only other major industrialized country that retains and actively uses the death penalty is Japan.
And you'd reminded me of this before the show, and I'd looked this up. Of course, the reason they did it is because they have a Charles Manson type cult figure whose followers like to put poison gas, nerve gas.
The most recent use of the death penalty by Japan was 25 years ago or so. There was a terrorist attack by this millennialist death cult, Shinriko, I think is how you pronounce it, that involved releasing sarin, a lethal nerve agent, in the Tokyo subway, and it killed about a dozen people, injured many more. And the way that the Japanese legal system works is that once all the appeals for all the people convicted with respect to a single crime are settled, then the penalties can be carried out, and they were carried out earlier this year.
Right. Now, there have been efforts to use the courts to end the death penalty in the U.S. Why don't we go in reverse chron order and start with some of the most recent?
So, let's actually start further back. In the 1970s, I believe that would still have been the court in the High Brennan period. Justice William Brennan, namesake of the liberal judicial policy advocacy group that you can read about on InfluenceWatch, the Brennan Center for Justice.
Yeah, started by his law clerks.
Started by his clerks when Brennan retired. This was sort of the high period of liberal judicial activism, of living constitutionalism. And as part of that, there was a series of Supreme Court cases on the death penalty. And one of those cases ordered a moratorium for a few years. It was later overturned, obviously. But there was a brief period when capital punishment was prohibited during this period of the high liberal
activist.
Yeah, liberal activist, living constitutionalist jurisprudence, especially in criminal justice. Fast forward to today, obviously in in 2016, Antonin Scalia, the conservative originalist, dies, leaves a vacancy. Liberals start preparing, because it takes a case a couple years to get through the lower courts to get to the point where you can go to the Supreme Court and say, rule on this question. So there's a push by liberal interest groups to get a case to once and for all decide that the death penalty is unconstitutional. Now, that effort suffered a setback, obviously, when Neil Gorsuch is appointed to the court. The presumption, Gorsuch, like Scalia, is an originalist conservative. The presumption is that Gorsuch would likely find that the Constitution, which sort of presupposes the existence of a death penalty, does not violate the Eighth Amendment.
Yes, or just to spin that out a touch more, there's more than one place in the Constitution that explicitly presumes the death penalty is going to exist. Now, the conservative justices would not, if pick a state, if the state of California decides they pass a law saying we're not going to have a death penalty, it is inconceivable that any conservative jurist who's ever been on the court would say, well, I don't like that. I think it's swell
we have 19,
to have
we have
one.
19 states that have, by their legislative action, there may have been a couple that did it by the courts, but largely by legislative action have
said we're not going to have the death penalty.
Washington D.C.
Yes.
doesn't have the death penalty
Yes.
for local crimes. Puerto Rico doesn't have the death penalty.
No conservative justice on the court is going to say,
I
prefer that legislatures pass laws
that Puerto Rico or that Michigan have to have, both of which have abolished, have to have the death penalty.
Yes. So just to make it a little clearer just how egregious it is for a left-wing justice who has no respect for the Constitution's black and white text or for the system of government that it presumes where people get to make their own laws, thinks nothing of saying, I really don't think that's a good thing. Plus, you mentioned about the international stuff. Of course, some of the left-wing justices like to make the point, in international law, the death penalty isn't respected.
And this is where we get to the present day, or just before the present day. So March 2018, this is back when Anthony Kennedy is still sitting on the court. Anthony Kennedy has in the past expressed openness to looking at international law and practice. And so an Arizona man convicted of a double murder, it is petitioned on his behalf to the Supreme Court to ask the question whether the death penalty in and of itself violates the Eighth Amendment in light of contemporary standards of decency. That contemporary standards of decency, by the way, is written explicitly for Anthony Kennedy. You may remember from our podcast about his retirement when we were discussing the groups that we're going to be fighting that are, as we speak, fighting over the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to replace him, former Justice Kennedy. Kennedy's jurisprudence is very airy-fairy. Again, I think it was Sara Bomari of Commentary who called him balderdash. That's probably the most accurate descriptor of it. To get an idea of how serious this challenge was, the chief counsel, the lawyer who wrote the brief, was Neil Katyal, who was, after the appointment of Elena Kagan to the Supreme Court, acted as Solicitor General in the Obama administration.
Yes. And by the way, we should also point out, again, to show the lack of respect for the rule of law or even just the barest consistency, the Justice Kennedys and others who were willing to, at times, invoke international law and practice, meaning what other countries do, well, they did it on a highly selective basis because, just to take an example at random, abortion laws in Europe actually tend to be much less radically pro-abortion than American abortion law under our judge-made law of Roe v. Wade and the Casey decision and whatnot. No one says, we should have laws on abortion as restrictive as Sweden because that's what Europe does. They only use it when it fits their particular policy preferences and ignore it when it doesn't. But you mentioned the groups now fighting over the Kavanaugh nomination, and of course, some of those same groups are active in the death penalty question. So let's talk a bit about the funders behind the death penalty challenge.
The biggest, they're not the biggest funder, but the funder that's probably most specifically interested in the death penalty issue, in death penalty abolition, is the Proteus Fund, which is like the Tides Foundation. It's an ideological left-wing group that, rather than a traditional foundation like the Ford Foundation or like Open Society Foundations or MacArthur Foundation, rich guy makes a lot of money doing something. He knows that he is going to pass on into the next world. He sets up a corporate entity to hold some portion of his wealth, some substantial portion of his wealth, writes said corporate entity a check, and that institution continues its existence. And liberal foundations don't have to worry about donor intent typically, so they can exist perpetually. They exist perpetually off the appreciation of the assets that they were given. So I'm pretty sure the Ford Foundation was seeded by a bunch of Ford Motor Company stock, was it not?
Exactly. The whole problem was that Henry Ford's lawyers came to him and said, the government's going to take most of your fortune unless we find some way to keep it out of the greedy government's hands, and we think the way we should do that is by your dumping your stock into a foundation.
And of course, because capitalists have to worry about donor intent, Ford Foundation now uses the money that was it Henry Ford I or Henry Ford II?
Henry Ford I.
Henry Ford I tried to hide away from the taxman to take everyone's money and give it to the taxman.
Yes. Life is full of irony.
Life is full of irony. So what Proteus Fund, Tides Foundation, on the right, there's Donors Trust. What they do is you are a rich guy, you have money, you would like to put towards an ideological cause, but you don't want to go through all the trouble of setting up a corporate entity and hiring people and, wondering whether your heirs are going to do what you want to do with it. So there's this already existing corporate entity run by people who are ideologically committed to whatever the ideology is. You write them a check, and they decide then what to do with it. Now, you can also have a donor-advised fund, which is where you tell those managers, give it to X group. So what Proteus Fund does is they take money from liberal rich guys and liberal foundations and package it and put it into projects. One of which is the Eighth Amendment Project, which was and is the long-term campaign to find the magical case that is going to get the Supreme Court to overturn the death penalty.
Yes, well, or forbid citizens from governing themselves on this policy question. Yes. So, and one of the ways they're not just seeking cases of grotesque murderers that they can claim should somehow not suffer the death penalty, but they also are even working against the means typically used of the death penalty. Is that not right?
They and others. We mentioned that Europe has universally gotten rid of the death penalty. A lot of major pharmaceutical companies, which make the sedatives that go into the cocktails that are used for executions, they both, for their own corporate ethical reasons and because the various parts of European law have started sniffing around about trying to prohibit it and sanction companies that assist in judicial executions. They have started to say, no, you can't use our products for this. We won't sell it. There was a case in Nevada where a drug maker, I believe it was a European drug maker, went to the court and said, we insist that the state not use our drug for executions, and the Nevada Supreme Court said that they had the right to proscribe the state of Nevada from buying the execution drugs from them.
Yep. And we should add that there are left-wing activist groups that have tried to, in various ways, to not just that way, but also sometimes like just forbid the manufacture of a drug or whatnot. So they're trying to make it impossible for the states to actually obtain the drugs that they use in the cocktails, as you put it. And we should explain to folks about typically the way the cocktails work is that the person to be executed first is given sedatives, so that essentially it's like you're going to have an operation. If they're going to take your appendix out, they knock you out so you don't feel your appendix.
They it's like a sedative and muscle relaxant, and then what actually kills you.
Yes, and then then they give you a dose of a drug that's going to stop your heart from beating, and that's the way it works. And so again in ironies,
I mean, and here's where I kind of have to jump in. That's the theory of how it works. There have been a number of cases where it hasn't gone like that, and I think that there's a very important line that should be drawn when we're talking about whether the death penalty is humane in terms of causing an effectively instantaneous, I mean, dying hurts, but minimally painful death, and whether it's merely bloodless. If you want to kill somebody immediately, instantaneously, and irreversibly, the guillotine does that. It's also very bloody. So I don't necessarily advocate bringing back the guillotine, but I think that supporters of the death penalty with something like lethal injection I think the way that it sets up as completely bloodless, it doesn't look like you're killing somebody, because that's what we're doing. We have decided, we the state, we the government, we the people who elect the government have decided that there are some crimes for which a man must pay with his life. And by using this sort of pseudo medicalized procedure with what looks like with effectively an operating table and guys with a needle, rather than men in police uniforms with police hats and 30-06 rifles, that are we making it clear to ourselves the moral consequences of what we're doing? That we have decided this man must die, so we are going to kill him.
Yes. So, well, I agree with you. I think it's entirely reasonable for people to ask the proponents of the death penalty whether lethal injection makes sense as a method. At the same time, the left-wing opponents of it should have to, should not be able to hide, as they sometimes have, by surreptitiously trying to prevent the obtaining of the drug cocktail, and then turn around and say, because you can't obtain the drug cocktail, you can't.
And I agree with that. And I think that it therefore follows that we do have to ask that question about are we using a bloodless method or a humane method, and they may not be the same. And again, I believe. I favor retaining capital punishment for serious crimes. And I think the purpose of it is for the state to enact retribution for the most heinous offenses. But I think a part of that retribution is that you obviously support capital punishment, we who support it have to be very clear that this is what we are doing and this is why we are doing it. And I question sometimes whether strapping a man to a table and sticking a needle in his arm does that.
No, that's that's a good segue, because I want us to take a step back from the funding and the activist groups for a second and discuss the bigger picture arguments about this. Now, we've been discussing here one of the arguments, which is objections to the death penalty methods that are used.
Objection to the process of lethal injection.
There's also the objections based on the claim that it's unfair or arbitrary, and then lastly that it's wrong in principle. So let's turn next then to the arbitrary issue.
So, many of the left-leaning critics of the American criminal justice system and of the death penalty in particular argue that it is more likely to be used on ethnic minorities. There are very good historical reasons to believe that might be the case. One kind of sore red thumb statistic, 90% of men who were executed for rape from 1930 to 1967 were African American. That is wildly out of line with both obviously the proportion in the general population, but also the proportion who committed comparable crimes. Now, since 1967, though the number, obviously, another judicial intervention, the Supreme Court has ruled that it is unconstitutional to use capital punishment for any crime other than murder, or crime that leads to death as if murder. Terrorism, drug. The Supreme Court invented this term that hasn't been well defined: drug kingpin activity. I believe that is one of Anthony Kennedy's contributions to American jurisprudence. Unless the crime leads to intentional death, the Supreme Court has ruled it cannot be punished by death. So now looking at murder, from 1977 to 1999, African American men have actually received fewer death sentences than their share of murders. Now, there are a couple of weird dynamics interacting with this. While black murderers are less likely to be punished by death, white victims are more likely to have their murderer punished by death. Most violent crime in the United States is committed by people against people they know. The way that the United States' social dynamics interact, that's mostly people of the same race. So most whites who are murdered by other whites. Result: if you're punishing punishing murderers more harshly for white victims, you're going to punish more white murderers more harshly. But there's another we want to discuss self-government. There's a self-government issue because most African-American murder victims are in jurisdictions where more of the voters are African-Americans, and African-Americans are more likely to sit on juries, and African-Americans largely oppose the death penalty and are less likely to institute it. So, again, to the extent to which it is, racist white juries punishing murderers of whites more harshly versus African-American jurors exercising their sort of sovereign right to not institute the death penalty, it's kind of not clear.
Yes, well, it's certainly tricky, and I'd completely agree with you that if the system is systematically discriminating against any racial group, that's appalling, and that would work to delegitimize the penalty.
Even the appearance hurts the credibility, and that's part of why I believe we should reserve the death penalty more. I mean, does Joker Senev, the terrorist who committed the Boston Marathon bombing, he's the kind of person I would target for capital punishment.
Sure, I guess you could say of another version of this kind of the kind of thing we're getting into now is some people oppose the death penalty because of the uncertainty that always revolves around cases.
Yeah, so here we're getting into now arguments about the death penalty in principle, and there's the weak argument is that argument from uncertainty, that we can't know with ontological, God's eye view certainty. I mean, we can know with reasonable human certainty whether somebody did it, but we can't know whether they, were they hearing voices? Were they fully and totally sane, fully and totally responsible for their actions? Of course, you take this argument to its logical conclusion, and then the only punishments that are valid are fines and forfeitures. Because you can restore, if you find somebody and it turns out they didn't do it, you can give them their money back. You can give them their money back with interest.
But you can't if you put them in
if
prison.
If you put them in jail, you can't give them their time back. You
Yes.
can give them money compensation for that time, but if you offered, these poor guys who get sent away for 20 years for a rape they didn't commit, then DNA evidence, then they finally test the DNA evidence. Oops, they didn't do it. Even if they get, $1 million or $2 million settlement, if you shot him full of truth, you probably don't even need to shoot him full of truth serum. They'll probably straight up tell you, I'd rather have a quarter of my life back. Obviously, it's better that they were given prison rather than the death penalty, because there is at least some reversibility imprisonment. But in these cases where we know Timothy McVeigh was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, we know he did it. maybe we don't know ontologically whether he was fully and totally and completely sane, to the extent crazy conspiracy theorist terrorist can be fully and completely sane. But there's no doubt. There's no doubt as to his perpetration of the crime.
Yeah. Well, I would just interject that the traditional common law understanding of an insanity defense was reasonable and limited, I think. And the simplest way I've heard it explained is, if I strangle you to death, and I think that I'm wringing a dish rag and not someone's neck, that is insanity that prohibits me from being punished for my action because I genuinely didn't even understand the action.
As we've gotten more knowledge about mental illness, okay, well, if I believe, if I'm wringing your neck and I believe that Pope Pius XIII is telling me that, Jesus is commanding me to do it, that I'm not fully responsible for my actions. It's not as simple as, well, I was angry, therefore. But all of these sort of uncertainty questions I find are lacking, because there are cases where we know the perpetrator with reasonable human certainty, even more than beyond a reasonable doubt, that we know with reasonable human certainty that they knew what they were doing. And that therefore we have, as a state, we have no choice but to punish them. The only question is how.
Well, now let's move to the most extreme form of the argument, which is held including by some notable conservatives like Charles Cook at the National Review, for instance, that the government should never kill.
So I will let Mr. Cook, the editor of National Review Online, I will give him the credit of using his own words to outline his argument. Quote, "I'd venture we also expect a police officer arresting a violent criminal to spare his charge because we draw a moral distinction between people who are threatening us and people who are not. Morally, does this calculation really change if the guilty person has been brought through court? By and large, we execute people in the United States by choice and not by necessity, as retribution or as an example to others, which we call deterrence, or because it brings closure to the bereaved. We do it not so that those inside the prison gates might be safer, but so that those outside feel that justice has been served, performing in ceremony what Albert Camus called, quote, the most premeditated of murders, close quote." So that's the argument. The argument is essentially that, obviously if you or I were in a self-defense situation, and let's assume we're in Virginia where stand your ground applies and there's no duty to retreat and there's a castle doctrine and all that. If somebody came at me with if I'm in Virginia and assume I was legally authorized to carry a concealed firearm, and somebody came at me with a tire jack, a jack handle or something, crowbar, and I can draw my weapon and shoot that person, possibly to death. Now, if I pull my weapon, he drops the tire iron, I can't shoot him. He's no longer a threat if he surrenders. And what Cook is doing essentially is applying that logic to the state, that a police officer, an agent of the state, can kill the guy with the crowbar if he's coming at him. But if he's subdued him and taken him into custody and he's been judged by 12 and found guilty of, in this case, it would be attempted murder, but if he's been found guilty of murder, then that's the same as if he dropped the crowbar, as if he were coming at me and he dropped the crowbar.
Yeah, but I actually object to multiple things that Cook says there. It's complicated. He's saying that he is claiming to know the motivations behind the reasons that people support the death penalty, which is not the same thing as the moral question of the rightfulness of the death penalty. I don't personally, as a proponent of the death penalty, I don't think that he says, we don't do it so that those inside the prison gates might be safer. Well, I care about that. If some poor guy is working as a prison guard, and they are killed from time to time.
There are cases where prisoners who are in for life murder other prisoners.
Yes, I care about the prisoners' lives. I don't think that their lives are insignificant, and I don't think that the prison guards' lives are insignificant. So that isn't true. There's also, he does mention here deterrence, and that too, I don't think that's the sum total of the moral argument, but that's a significant part of the moral argument. There are no shortage of cases where people in the midst of committing heinous crimes have stepped back or reconsidered because, no, I'm not going to do that. They've said, people, victims have heard criminals say, no, I can't do that because I'd be liable for the death penalty.
Quibble here a bit. There is very little statistical evidence. There is very little statistical evidence that shows any sort of wide. Again, maybe in a particular case, somebody drops the crowbar because they fear the noose. Nationwide statistics don't show this.
Well,
as a general proposition.
Well, it is absolutely the case that no reasonable person would say that deterrence always works. The precise degree of effect is unknowable. The one thing you could say is obviously that there are certainly criminals who are indifferent to such, absolutely there would be ones indifferent, but there absolutely are ones who do care.
And here's where again I come at support for retaining the death penalty from a different angle. It's precisely those people who cannot be deterred. The Timothy McVeighs, the Dylann Roof, the terrorist who shot up the African American church in Charleston, South Carolina. Sarnav, if we had taken any of the, if we had taken Osama bin Laden alive, if we had, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is sitting somewhere, he should face, my belief is he should face trial for his life. These people who have committed a crime against the state so heinous and so threatening to the very existence of our social fabric. The Roof case is sort of a perfect example here. If you read, his manifesto apparently was that he was going to spark race war in South Carolina. Now, knowing anything about the history of the United States, that is a motive threatening the entirety of our social fabric. And, again, whether the victims' families want it or not, the state must put its foot down in the most clear and the most total fashion that it can, in my view.
Yeah. Well, this gets us to the to religious questions again about in principle whether the rightness or wrongness of it. You are talking, of course, about retribution or paying justice to the most heinous of criminals.
Paying justice because again, one of the objections would be that, if the families want to forgive, but the state cannot. The state must carry out. It must carry out its role.
Yes.
Again, if the families wish to forgive, that is their right. That is their Christian charity. But the state has none.
Well, and the two things are separate anyway. The justice and mercy, especially, by the way, sadly, I don't think our current Pope has a very clear understanding of this, but which I regret to say as a zealous convert to Catholicism, but. The things are not opposed at all, which is one reason why there's no saint on record as being appalled by the death penalty. In fact, there are saints on record as praying for the conversion at the gallows of criminals, because those things are separate. The justice is done by the state to remedy the disorder in the, society, and God's forgiving the person or friends and loved ones of a victim forgiving the person, those are not remotely in conflict. It's not the same. The mother of the murdered child does not stand in the same relation to the criminal as the government does, which must care about such things being done.
And I think we can see some of this sort of fundamental imbalance in retribution in what has been the European experience. Several years ago, there was I think it's fair to call him a neo-Nazi, attack.
Scandinavia.
Yeah, in Norway. He made an assassination attempt on the prime minister, which was actually a diversion from an attack on the Norwegian Labour Party's youth retreat for members of the Young Labour Party. Killed, I want to say, some more than 70 people. The maximum sentence and the maximum punishment that he could receive under Norwegian law is essentially 21 years at Club Fed, at a prison facility that we in the United States would consider effectively minimum security. Now, it's a little bit more restrictive than that. He's effectively in solitary confinement, which is a serious punishment, but 21 years for 70 dead. That strikes me as out of balance.
Yes, and the one of the things about all this that should matter to us is, on the one hand, we don't want just mob, the pure revenge and idea of mob violence is a bad thing. Right. That's another reason that you should have the government doing this with proper due process, the government carrying it out rather than mobs.
Because mobs have no justice. Mobs, the more your legal system looks like a mob, the more it looks like the American legal system from the 30s, where we have severe racial and ethnic disparities in the way punishments are handed out, where we have, the more orderly, the more procedural. Again, it can be frustrating to see these things taking 15, 20 years, but to prevent error and to ensure a just outcome, this is necessary.
Yes, well, and the point about justice, of course, is precisely that people are responsible for their actions. The one of the silliest things the current pope has said is that the death penalty is an assault on human dignity, as if the only way to be kind to human dignity is to be gentle, in all things. Well, first of all, any Marine drill instructor could explain to you that that isn't true. Any decent father of a child could tell you that that's nonsense. And the death penalty is carried out on you if you have done a horrible thing, because you are a moral agent who can be held responsible. If a dog killed someone,
this applies to any criminal punishment.
Yes.
You put somebody away for a year for theft, or 5 years for sexual assault. It is because you knowingly and with either in the case of murder, malice aforethought, but in the case of lesser crimes, you should have known better. Because we know that you should have known better, we feel it appropriate to exact retribution from you.
Yes, we treat you we give you the dignity of being a moral agent that is responsible in a way that a true crazy person or an infant or an animal is not. Plus, of course, we show respect for the dignity of the person you murdered. That person's dignity needs vindication as well. But even the thing to remember too is, while one of the great virtues of a proper death penalty is that the state with careful and proper due process carries it out rather than a mob, but it isn't crazy that people are angry. In fact, the anger has to be channeled properly, but it is in and of itself a good thing to be. I should be angry. If I see you murdered on the street, I should be angry. Now, some of our younger listeners may not appreciate, memory may not go back to the nadir of New York City in its pre-Giuliani days, but it was notorious that there would be a crime on the street, somebody mugged on the street, left on the sidewalk, and people would be indifferent.
And the interesting thing, the sort of the lesson, I think, of the Renaissance of New York City is compare New York City to Chicago. Both are interestingly, both in non-death penalty states. Both what separates them? They both have very strict gun control. They're both high tax jurisdictions. They both, demographically are fairly similar. The difference is that New York decided that it was going to take the business of crime and punishment seriously. They were going to crack down on the networks of crime. They were going to crack down on, on even low-level crime, and ensure that order would be instituted. And now that they've done that, they're at the point where they can start walking back some of the harsher methods. The most notable being the stop and frisk police tactic. Whereas Chicago, where corruption has been allowed to fester in the police force, and the public officials have not made getting a handle on crime job one, there is disorder, and and again, part of what you have when you have disorder is the law of vendetta. I don't know how many of the murders in Chicago are people getting revenge for
previous murders.
Getting revenge for friends that got injured or killed. But the inability of the state to control that sort of behavior breeds further disorder and breeds what you have. Whereas in New York, because there is now order, the things that liberals say they want from the criminal justice system now are far less costly.
Yes. Well, and the last thing I would say is that we mentioned at the beginning that even in the state of California, the populace at large has this traditional common sense understanding of do wrong, get punished, in a way that their supposed betters in power do not.
It has to be, with the exception of the death penalty, which I believe we should keep. I'm fairly liberal on criminal justice, but the only way that you can have that is to have order instituted.
In the first place.
Yeah.
Well, we'll let you have the last word on that for this week. But as I said at the beginning, we have an announcement, which is beginning next week. We will be switching to a new format for the shows. It will feature mostly Mike. It'll be short and quick and lots of updates.
Quick updates. So, obviously on this show, we've been going, very in depth, very deep into issues and influencers. The new format will be most of them will be more, updates. Some of the groups that you've heard about on this show, what are they up to now? Now that we've gotten to the bottom of some of these big public policy issues, what's going on in Washington behind the scenes this week, and who's behind it? That's right. So we will be keeping the same time for the show, and we want to ask everybody, please, if you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. You can also find podcasts at the Capitol Research Center's YouTube and Facebook pages. We really appreciate you listening, and join Mike next week for the next InfluenceWatch podcast.